Hey, we're in the Civil War and Reconstruction unit, and the lesson that we're going to look at today is a geographical look prior to the Civil War. And this is on page 10 in the workbook. And if you're not using a workbook, well, then you can end up just looking right on Spark. Our objective that we're going to look at today is by the end of the lesson, we should be able to understand the geographical causes of the United States Civil War by analyzing the effects created by political policies during the Civil War era. And we're going to use some historical maps that I found prior to this, and we're going to use them as some artifacts to show some evidence of cause and effect. Our essential question for our lesson today is, how does geography matter when it comes to the tensions created by the Civil War? So we're going to look at see how these tensions really kind of came to be based on just about 100 to 50 years or so prior to the Civil War. So let's get started here. So the first slide that we're going to look at on page 10 is American cities in 1860, and one of the things I want you to do first is to draw the line of latitude that divides the North and South. There was a line that was created by a compromise of 1820, and this was pretty much set up in regards to just making things real even in terms of slavery for the country. There was already sort of some tension and animosity toward slavery, since the Civil War main reason was of slavery. So this prior to the Civil War, which was Civil War started in 1861, so this is about 40 years prior to that. We ended up having that the states are like, well, let's make a line, and anything south of this 36 degrees north latitude, 30 minutes north, we're going to end up having this be no slaves, and anything south of this line, slavery can be legal. So, the question I want to ask too is, by looking at this map, is by observing the detail of the map on page 10, which if you're using the workbook, it's in there, and if you're just using the assignment on Spark, there will be no page number. What evidence has shown that the North could have a significant advantage in decisions of the country? Now, looking at the map, I want you to focus on the key to the map, which is right over here too, and just kind of ponder the idea here. What might be something significant? Well, if you haven't thought of anything yet, one of the main things that we're really looking at this map is population. And the majority of the population in the United States in 1860 was in the north. And we had huge cities. This was pretty much right the epicenter of the country. So within that, the north, this created a huge advantage when it came down to the Civil War. When we started the Civil War, for the North, we had a lot more people living up there, and because of that, we had a lot more soldiers, we had a lot more supplies, and that became one of the main reasons that the North won the Civil War. Moving on, what we have is this distribution of the slaves in 1790. I bring up this map because slavery was the key issue of the Civil War. Slavery really was why the Civil War occurred and why it was fought. So when we look at this, I give you the compromise of 1820 line here, and this key thing with this is in 1790. This was when this map was this data for the map was looked at, and this is about 20 years after the founding of the country. one of the questions I pose here is, what is the majority of the land in the United States labeled as based on in the key to the bottom left in the screen there? What's the main use of the land in the United States at this time? Well, what I hope you kind of saw was looking at this is that we have a lot of territory that is unsettled. We have also a lot of territory that is really 10% slave owners. If I can kind of 10% slave owners here, and the majority of slaves are located right along the coast here in Southern America. I mean, as as much as this issue, people that had slaves were passionate about having slaves. The issue never was thought of as maybe dividing the nation as much as it came to be with the Civil War. Number two question I want to pose is, where seems to be the majority of the slaves located? We just stated that, or I just stated that, and then in 1790 here, the majority of them are along the coast, like I just said, and along the original colonies of the country. And lastly, I want to point out is, what is the physical boundary of the Spanish Louisiana, Mexico, and the United States? Right here in 1790, the Mississippi River is the end of the country. We still haven't gotten the Louisiana Purchase, and so this idea of the slavery being a big issue really isn't on the forefront of America, like I said. The next map I'm bringing up is the distribution of slaves in 1860, right prior to the Civil War. Now you can see that we have expanded way. I mean, the Manifest Destiny, which is in prior lessons to this, we are seeing it in full effect. We are touching the Atlantic Ocean and we are touching the Pacific Ocean, and so this is in full effect. Also, California became a country in became a state. So right there, we are touching the Pacific and touching the Atlantic, and we have slavery really increasing here all along up until Texas. I mean, we are really spreading out. So the Compromise of 1820 really puts into account here. Now we're seeing a division, and this is huge. Question that I pose is, based upon the 1860 map, what is the majority of the land of the country labeled as based upon the key? Even though we have slavery being a main issue, we still have a lot of unsettled land, and this is being fought for in terms of what should we label it as? Should we label it as slaves? Can slavery be legal, or is it going to be an illegal? We had the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which we talked about before, which Missouri and all the way up here underneath our question here, Maine. Missouri was a slave state, and Maine was considered an unslaved state based on California becoming a state. And now what is being fought after within this in 1860 is we're really looking at New Mexico, Utah choosing what it's going to be, and we're also seeing any other territories that would bring the imbalance here of slaves or unslaved. So roughly how much, question I want us to look at too is, roughly how much did the distribution of slaves change from 1790s to 1860s? We pointed that out a little bit ago. Moving on to the next slide here, the Compromise of 1850. I just mentioned this in the last slide before, but to give you a good map of this here, this is on page 14 here. That you can see that Missouri is a state that's a slave state, and Maine, as said before, is a non-slave state, and we have Utah and New Mexico deciding which they want to go. This was really bringing a lot of imbalance in the country, and this really was, like, at the time in 1860, we are at the brink of war here. So, question I wanted us to ponder is, how did the Compromise of 1850 set up the stage for division among the northern and southern regions? As I said before, we have this dividing line, and because that dividing line is not, so concrete anymore, a lot of southern states are really trying to push that slavery should be the way to go. At the time here, the second to last map I want us to look at is in 1856. We have President James Buchanan. Now, James Buchanan was in 1856 was elected president, and what his views was that he was morally opposed, and I'm just reading it right here, morally opposed to slavery, but believed it was protected by the Constitution. Slavery was a law, and it was protected, that you can have slaves. But at the end of his presidency, 7 states would be thinking about seceding from the Union. He was as president, he believed that it was protected by the Constitution, but morally, since he opposed it, it really, as his presidency started, getting to its end, a lot of southern states were really feeling that, it was time for us to, a state like Mississippi down here, that we should have our own rights to own slaves and not be susceptible to states in the north. So with that in mind, though, I bring up this question, is that when he was elected, though, where was the majority of the support for President Buchanan? And that was in the southern states here. Is that these states, even though they were, it was kind of like a last-ditch effort to keep the Union together, is that Buchanan was very for, following the Constitution, and the slave states did feel like, oh, hey, this would be, we believe that he's going to follow through. And as we can see in, why was this significant? Because it just stated that it was a last-ditch effort to keep the Union together. But as we kind of come to the next one, Abraham Lincoln is elected president in 1860, and we have our Compromise of 1820 line here. You can see that Lincoln was elected to, there was a lot of, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 main players which are fighting for the president's seat in 1860, and I think a lot of that caused Lincoln to be elected. But you can also see that where was support for Lincoln? The support for Lincoln was in the North majority. We had a little bit here in California, a little bit in Oregon Territory. But since the majority of his support was in the North, why is this significant? It's because really the majority of the population was also in the North as well. So even though the amount of area for Lincoln voted against, for the country, voted against Lincoln, the majority of the population in the North voted for him, caused him to be president. The popular vote was not quite Lincoln's, but the Electoral College ended up getting Lincoln voted in. Some questions to ponder at the end of our lesson here. What evidence in this lesson gave you significant reasoning that a civil war would occur? Write out your answer. Give me your best thoughts. Be persuasive on that when you answer that question. And if you lived back in the 1860s, where do you feel you would be on policies if you lived in the southern state? If you lived in a southern state, where would you be? What would you be? Really for slavery, even though now we're on the other side of it? Would you feel that this was evident that we need